Welcome to The Nature of Story, conversations about storytelling in society. I'm Michael Neelsen. Today's guest is Kendall Haven. He's a research scientist and author of two major books on the neuroscience of storytelling. The first book that he wrote is the first one that I read. It's called Story Proof, The Science Behind the Startling Power of Story. It presents the first ever proof that story structure is an information delivery system powerhouse evolutionarily hardwired into human brains. He draws upon research done in a variety of other fields, like early childhood development. There's so many that have kind of touched on the fringe of storytelling and how stories develop in the human brain from a very early age. From a very early age, can't talk today, it's absolutely fascinating. But as a research scientist, he has also done a lot of his own research, and that is covered in his second book, his follow-up, called Story Smart, Using the Science of Story to Persuade, Inspire, Influence, and Teach, which he released in 2014. I have actually not read Story Smart yet, but I am such a fan of Story Proof that I immediately purchased Story Smart on Amazon, and I have it sitting right in that big pile of to-read books behind me, so hopefully I'll get to it pretty soon. But Kendall was a fantastic guest. I think you're going to get a ton of value out of what he has to say in this hour. We talk about a number of things, including his background at NASA and trying to advocate for the persuasive power of storytelling to people at NASA to help them get the messages out that they wanted to get out about the value of their research. We also talk about what he calls the neural story net, which is one of the core kind of philosophical beliefs that I have as a storyteller and that I preach as much as I can to everybody, that in communication, your goal is to get an idea or a feeling or an emotion or a concept into the brain or heart of some other person, of your audience. And that being the goal, you need to, in some way, it can't just be about what you want to say. It has to be about constructing what you say in a way that cuts through their sensory exterior and hits the unconscious mind. So he talks about this idea, you've got the five senses, right? We interpret so much in the world that never reaches our conscious mind. We never actually notice it because our brain filters them out as irrelevant information. If we want to cut through that, we have to structure what we want to communicate in a way that does cut through that our brain doesn't disregard as irrelevant information. And using story structure is one of the easiest ways to do that. Not in terms of rigor, like it's not like an easy process, but it encounters the least amount of resistance when telling it. So he gets into that to a great extent, and it's just a fantastic hour. This is an episode that I go back to many times in subsequent episodes. So I really hope you enjoy it. And without further ado, I bring you Kendall Haven. Starting off with kind of the big question here that I'm fascinated in finding out, and I know your answer too, but I want to talk to you about it. Is that definition of storytelling and the definition of story, and why that's important in the first place?
Well, it'll be interesting to see if you do think you know what I'm going to say. The question is, why in the world do we care?
Right.
And I think there are two bits of information that sort of hint at that. One is that deep down in everyone's heart, soul, and also in their conscious mind, everyone believes stories are incredibly powerful, that they engage people, that they influence people, that is, have the ability to change attitudes, beliefs, values, behavior. So they're an incredibly effective business tool as well as personal tool. The second bit, all the research that's been done says that less than 1% of all of the quote unquote stories that impinge upon you have any impact at all. 99+% go in one ear or in one eye, I suppose, if you see it, in one ear and out the other. They don't move you. They don't register in your short or long-term memory. They don't get recalled. They don't invoke any emotional involvement. They don't influence. So the question is, if those two things are both true, then what is it about that tiny percentage of stories that do have some impact? What is it they hold in common? Why do they work and the other ones don't? And that's when we start to think about, well, what is a story? And here, the dictionary is of course, I think, the source of most people's confusion, because the dictionary I won't get on my harangue about the dictionaries, but let me just say their definition of story makes story, plot, and narrative all interchangeable. And that's just not true. That's just not right. So people look at what is the definition of a story because they want to figure out, how do I make my stories work better? That's why. So what we did was say, well, what do you want to have a story do? And the answer to that is always, we want to have something happen inside the head, in the brain of a target audience. That's what you want. The problem is, we've never been able to look inside people's brains. So we've had to go with those external cues. You listen for an audience. If you're working with a live audience, you watch facial expressions, you watch body posture, you listen to the audience, you learn all those cues as a storyteller, and use those as surrogates for what's going on inside their head, but they are just very gross surrogates. And so my goal was to say, well, has there been research done that would give us some clues? No one has given any serious dollars to research directly on storytelling until 2011. So anything that was done before that was done in an EEG lab or fMRI lab, those kind of research labs, had to be done for some other purpose. So I started cruising through about 15, 16 fields of science that might be funded. Developmental psychology, the evolutionary biology, clinical psychology, information science, sort of medical research on brain anatomy and brain function, all those sorts of fields, looking for information that in and of itself actually, though it was done for a different purpose, related to story. All right, collected all of that. That's the book Story Proof, really. But to get to a definition of story, we then I wanted to take that information and say, can I show that it all works? Part of what came out of that research is the theory first proposed back in the 90s that the human brain has been evolutionarily hardwired to make sense and to create meaning in very specific story terms. So it's not something we learn. That theory said it's biological. It is literally, story is literally scripted into our DNA. And so that at birth, you are hardwired to bring in information, interpret it in very specific story terms, and record it that way. So we wanted to go into the lab and say, if we're going to figure out what is a story, what makes a story work, can we watch that happen? And that's when your friendly Department of Defense came in and was able to put some serious money into story research. So I was able to go into the lab and wire up audiences and take stories and manipulate and maneuver very small parts of the stories to watch how changing one little bit of a story would affect an audience differently than changing another little bit of the story. And not just for that moment of the story, but how it affected their understanding, the way they interpreted, made sense out of the whole story, and especially the emotional impact that they had at the end. So what we were able to do is a couple of things. One, verify that, there is physical neural wiring that lies between the sensory organs and the conscious mind, that is this neural story net that operates on in story terms. Its mandate, its initial job, is to make that initial sense of incoming information coming in through eyes or ears. It's part of that initial processing, and there's a whole lot of it that happens before information ever reaches your conscious mind. You're not aware of it because it doesn't happen in the conscious mind. But what reaches the conscious mind, we are able to show, is a self-created story-based version of the original source material, distorted from that source material in order to make it make sense to that individual. And they do it in story terms. So I said, well, if we can identify those terms that the neural story net in the human brain uses, that really then identifies what makes a story effective, because that's what the brain naturally gravitates toward. And we're able to show, as part of that sort of make sense mandate, that neural story net is willing to and able to distort incoming information radically. You can completely reverse the information of sentences, ignore parts, infer parts, reinterpret parts of incoming information to make it make sense to you. We do it all the time at a subconscious level. So what I came down to for definition of story then is really a two-part definition. One part is a list of those informational elements that the neural story net in the human brain uses. Why that? Because if you, in prepping a story, in thinking about the material you're going to prepare, deliver, consider those information elements. Who's the story about? What are they after? Goal. Why is it important to them? Motive. What problems, conflicts do they run into that block them from reaching the goal? How do those create risk and danger for the character? How does the character struggle? What are the sensory details that create the images that go into our mind? That list of information. That then means that the neural story net will distort your information less than someone else's information, so that your story reaches the conscious mind more intact. What's the definition of an effective story? One that gets to the conscious mind and memory vividly and in the form and with the content that you intended. So then the sentence definition is, what is the story? It's a character-based narrative. Narrative really meaning sentence and paragraph form, structured to provide the neural story net of your audience the information it needs to accurately and vividly convey your story to the conscious mind and memory of your audience. Why do you want to do that? Because if you're just doing stories for entertainment, you don't care as much. But if you have a purpose for your stories, there's something you want to use them to convey. There's a message, there's a theme, there's a concept you want to get across. You're trying to influence people, to inspire them, persuade them, change behavior, those things. Then you really care about what reaches the conscious mind, not what reaches the eyes and ears. And all of your impact happens, it depends on that version that reaches the conscious mind, which is this self-created, story-based version of your source material. So what is a story? A story, when we mean a story here, it's that small part of all of the narratives that actually have some impact. That little bit are character-based narratives constructed to provide those specific informational pieces that the neural story net of your audience requires in order to accurately and vividly portray and convey your story onto the conscious mind and memory.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, it's fantastic. And I there's so much I want to parse out of that and talk more about. But before we do, you've described yourself in the past, I believe, as one of the first storytellers in America with a science background. Could you give me a little bit of a picture for our audience when you talk about the research you're doing? How are you able to straddle those two lines?
Originally, the question was, what in the world was I doing in the world of science? And for a long time, I thought I had wasted getting advanced degree in science. Actually, it was in oceanography, and then doing for a decade leading a research team for the Department of Energy. I thought, boy, when I finally shifted to storytelling and realized, and when I bumped into the world of story and started to become aware of the impact and power that story has, I thought, boy, did I waste a bunch of years there. But it turns out what that meant was that I was comfortable with and familiar with the world of science, how science works, how it defines the terms, the vocabulary, the structural aspect of the way that that whole field operates and works. And this is in 82 when I dropped out, 82, 83, and joined the Storytelling Association. I was at that time the first one to become a storyteller who had an advanced degree in science. What it meant was that I just naturally gravitated toward the role of compiling and leading all of the research effort that we could do as a community of storytellers to try to validate and answer the big questions. Why do people listen to stories? Why do they remember stories? Why is information provided within the context of a story remembered more vividly and more accurately and recalled more readily than the same information provided through some other narrative means, let us say outside of what we would call an effective story? Why does that happen? And so those have been the threads that launched the research effort.
And some of the motivation for that, correct me if I'm wrong, came at one point in a relationship you had with NASA. Was that correct?
NASA, yeah, Goddard Space Flight Center. I was doing some work. I was just starting to piece together, not from the research, but just from my own experimentation on stage and talking other storytellers into doing little controlled experiments when they were on stage in front of an audience. The audiences rarely, if ever, knew, but we were testing what happens if you change this part of the story. What happens if you back off on the way you tell it? What happens if you, and so we would then be doing little experiments like that. And I was piecing together the informational elements that an audience requires if it's going to make sense, if it's going to understand and get involved with the story, vicariously transport themselves into the story, become emotionally invested in the story. And was invited to Goddard Space Flight Center to do a workshop with their science writers. And this was in the early 2000s, at a time when science people were realizing that they could no longer do what we did back in the 70s and early 80s when I was part of science, and that is say as a writer, I did the research, I'm going to write the article. If you want to get anything out of it, that's your responsibility, not mine. So if you want to, you're going to get bored reading this, and I don't care. You got to really dig through it to get anything out of it, and I don't care. If you want the info, you go get it. I already did it. I already did the work. And that attitude was starting to flip because they realized if they couldn't communicate with the outside world, and this is especially true of NASA Earth science folks, if they couldn't communicate what they did and what they were finding with the outside world, they were losing their relevance, their credibility, and therefore funding. So they were highly motivated to figure out, how do we get people to read our stuff? And that was at a time when their website, they launched a new Earth Sciences website, and were able to track not only when you went on the site. Now this is easy to do, but back then it was a little more revolutionary. They could not only track when you went on the site and what articles you went to, but how much time you spent on each page if it was a 6 or 7 page article. And what they found was that most readers, for most articles, had an atrocious drop-off rate. And of course, they were writing the way scientists do. What do you start with? You start with background and relevant concepts, and then you establish that you know what you're talking about by putting in a lot of cute references of past work, and then you put in your assumptions, and then you put in the limitations, and then you start to talk about what you're going to talk about, but you don't get to anything significant until the conclusions, and no one was getting there. So I started talking about story structure and story. And if this was a story, how would you structure it, and why is that better? And so it was a 90-minute talk. And at the end of it, a number of people came up from the audience in a little theater there at Goddard. And but one guy the only person who was in a suit, which says something, kind of the crowd parted for him. And it turns out that he was a guy from inside the Beltway. That's NASA headquarters. So there's inside the Beltway, and then there's everybody else, which are all the people in Goddard or JPL or Huntsville, all those places where they do the work. But This guy was from inside, and he came up to me and he said, um, "That's not the way we write." And I said, "You're right. It's not. That's what I'm talking about." And he said, "No, you're listening to me. That's not the way we write." I said, "No, it's not. This is better." And he said, "Oh yeah, prove it." And that's when I talked earlier about the going out to those 16 different fields of science. That's what launched it,
Yeah.
was that challenge at the time. And of course, by that time, there were a bunch of people standing around listening, and I was suckered in. So I said, "No problem. You want proof? No problem." And what I thought was I would collect a mass of anecdotal information from teachers, from ministers, from speakers, from motivational speakers, go to all those kind of people, and you know, if enough people say that they've seen the Loch Ness monster, then the Loch Ness monster has some credibility,
Right.
right? And I don't care if it's never shown up on any side scan radar or any other scientific instrument. I don't care if the people who have studied that ecosystem say that it couldn't support one, much less a breeding population of Loch Ness monsters. If enough people, if you have enough anecdotal information, it's admissible in court.
Right.
And I thought that's the way I was going to go until I started doing the research and realized that in every related field of neuroscience, people were looking at the brain function for totally different reasons, but ultimately they were all talking about how it functions in story terms.
Yeah.
And so that's when I realized that there was, I mean, some biology besides just cultural drives for why we listen to stories. So why do they belong in the business world? Because I don't care if you think you're telling a story, the people listening to you at a subconscious level will interpret and make sense out of what you say in story terms. Either you provide that information or they've got to create it on their own. And that's where you lose control of your message.
So let's talk about that, because I think that's the core thing a lot of my listeners will be thinking about in terms of business in particular. I could hear them in my head that they would say, why, if we're hardwired to interpret everything into story already, why do I need to do the hard work of putting it that way beforehand? And you
Easy.
say,
Because, and I'll give you some examples of how this, couple of examples of how this all works. But in general, what happens is that neural story net virtually instantly, I mean, in tenths of seconds, has to interpret and make sense out of the information that's coming into it. It looks for very specific bits of information. Is there a character here? Who are the characters? And there are several character positions, it turns out, that neural story net is trying to fill. Within the models that are built into that neural story net, there are certain character positions. The two that most people know about: main character or protagonist, and then the antagonist. And in a more general sense, the antagonist doesn't have to really be a character; it can be whatever is the major force that blocks the protagonist, the main character, from reaching some goal. So we want to know who's the character, what are they after, why are they after it, motive, then what blocks them from getting there, how does that create some sense of risk and danger, and risk and danger are actually the source of excitement and tension in a story. And as they say, as goes tension, so goes attention. Then we want to watch characters struggle. If they don't struggle, it always feels to the audience like they're bragging. You talk about what you've done, and we want to hear about the struggles. The more you struggle, the more we empathize with you, the more we sympathize, the more we identify with you and adopt at a subconscious level without even noticing it, start to adopt your viewpoint, your attitudes, your perspective on the world. It happens when we vicariously leap into the struggle of some other character. If they don't struggle, we don't enter. We don't go in. we don't start to identify with them, and then we need the details. So the thing is that neural story net will infer, imply, which is just fancy words for create, those bits of information if they aren't provided in the source material. When we research it, what we find, particularly for motives, very few people in business stories, they talk about what they've done. They talk about what they would need to do. They don't talk about why in terms that are meaningful to their target audience. Without that information, we find that virtually all audiences misguess motive. And in so doing, 9+ times out of 10 will infer far more self-centered, narcissistic, even sarcastic, even cruel motives on a character. And that includes the person who's telling the business story. If you've ever caught yourself wondering, why are they telling me this?
Right.
What do they really want? Why do they say in that? That's your brain searching for motive. And what we find is something that I'm now terming motive matching. If the motives that drive a character in a story match the basic motives that drive you, and that's values, beliefs, attitudes, those core values we've been, plus problems, issues, current drives. If a character's match yours, you start to identify with that character without ever consciously thinking of it. You automatically do. And in testing in the lab, I found I could turn audiences either toward a character or away from a character in a 10-minute story by changing one sentence that related to motive.
Wow.
Do it very predictably and do it very consistently. So what that means is, if you are telling a story, even if you don't think you're telling a story, you're doing a presentation live, business presentation, everyone who's listening to you is sifting through what you say, searching for those bits of information. And if you leave it up to your audience to infer and create those bits of key information on their own, you're willing to give up control of your message, and more likely than not, the message you intended is not getting through. And something that is much more negative from your point of view is actually getting through. Not yet. There's the classic stories about the business stories where the boss comes in and says, yeah, all right, here in this factory, this is what we're going to do. And everyone else rolls their eyes and goes, oh, now we're in trouble. Even though what the manager said was exactly the opposite. It's because that manager left unsaid those key bits of story information, and so all the audience had to infer them on their own.
Yeah. Well, you obviously we're skipping a whole lot in your book that backs up this scientifically. Like, I'm thinking now of your the tests that you cite about how people will always notice tone of voice more than what's actually being said, and all these sorts of things. And all this adds up to that story map that you're talking about, which is fascinating. And I urge anybody who's listening to this to check that out. But I want to focus on one specific thing you talked about there, which was the tension that's brought about by risk, by struggle, and by that being like a core part of storytelling. I've found in my experience working with clients that's one of the hardest things for businesses to jump onto, especially the way you've put it, which is that it's that you can't, that the problem can't have a ready-made solution. It can't be super obvious how you get out of this, where it's like, customer X had a problem and they simply hired us and we fixed it. Like, it can't be that.
We fixed it. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, you can say that, but what that does, that's one of those classic things that turns everyone off, because it sounds like you're bragging so much that then instantly they're turned against you.
Right.
To say, oh yeah, well, you're not that good. You can't be that good.
Right.
Stories require problems. Now, problems are not limitations. And a lot of people don't like that word problem. I was working with a Navy group, a little Navy story. This was now, oh gosh, 8, 9 years ago. Every few years, the CNO, Chief of Naval Operations, four-star admiral, gets rotated out, and he's the head guy in the Navy. And I don't remember who these individuals are. But one of them, as he rotated in, said, "The Navy will no longer have problems. We have challenges." And you understand what he was going after,
Sure.
right? He was a change of attitude. And 3 years later, I think 2.5, 3 years later, he rotated out. Another guy came in and said in a memo, "The Navy doesn't have challenges. We have opportunities." And it apparently became this huge joke. Sailors on ship would say, "Captain, we've got a great opportunity here. The ship is sinking." But you understand, it's not the vocabulary word that counts. It's the concept. Call them obstacles. That's the most neutral term I've ever come up with. If there aren't some obstacles to overcome to get to a goal, either the goal isn't worth getting to because it's so trivial, or your character, the person who's doing it, have to be fairly incompetent. Mm-hmm. Well, you don't want either of those. And if you have to exert effort, hire people, spend time working on something, then there were some obstacles to overcome. There's something you had to do. And in that same way, what it is you do is struggle. I don't know why people think that it's sort of the John Wayne approach. Shucks, little school marm, 'twarn't nothing. There was only 10,000 of them engines, and I had 2 pocket combs to fight them off with. Well, no, that we think that's cool. That never will influence people. It won't engage them. It won't vicariously bring them into the story and have them start to adopt your views and attitudes and positions. The more characters struggle, the more we empathize with them, the more we identify with them. And so it's the obstacles, but not just the obstacles, it's the risk and the danger that they engender for the main character that we really care about. Risk, definitions here. Risk is the likelihood of failure. It's a probability measure, probability of something going wrong. If there's very little probability things going to go wrong, well, who cares? It's going to go right anyway. If a professional football team is playing a high school football team, the risk is minimal that the pros are going to lose. Now, the other one is danger. Danger is the consequences of failure. It's what happens that's negative if something goes wrong. So if the pro team loses to the high schoolers, the consequences are huge. But would anyone get excited by that? No, because the probability of it, the risk, is so low. Literally, mathematically, if you take risk and normalize it on a scale of 1 to 0, and danger and normalize that on a scale of 1 to 0, multiply them together, call that excitement. It tracks exactly on an EEG scans with the neural measurements of excitement.
Wow.
And also with tension.
Wow.
So in your stories, if there is no tension, the audience will not engage. They won't project themselves into the story and think, how would I do in that situation? Or how is he going to make it? There's no suspense in the story. And the tools that control that are one, having a goal, something specific that the main character is trying for. Back it up with a motive that makes the audience start to empathize with the character, and then list the obstacles. Instead of trying to hide them under the rug, bring them out, show them, especially if you overcame them. Mm-hmm. You get a lot more credit if you overcame big obstacles than if you didn't.
Yeah. Well, and that aspect, I find it almost can be beneficial if talking about the pain hurts a little bit in the moment. Like you probably are closer to something that actually matters and actually has some emotion maybe in telling it. It's that emotional component you're talking about with the tension. Right. Do you find that this or it's something else maybe is the most common issue that you find business storytellers struggling with? Is there something else that you find as a primary challenge people run into?
That's a big one.
Yeah.
That is to say, sucking all of the energy out of their stories because they take obstacles, risk, and danger and struggles out, that's the story. The other one I think that I find a lot of people struggle with is what stories to use. And companies more often than not, and governmental agencies more often than not, and nonprofits more often than not that I work with, feel constrained to use actual historical real life event stories from their staff or from their clients or and those are fine, but they're not usually the most effective at getting across a concept.
Sure.
And the ones that are most effective look at the stories that have been used for 150,000 years by human beings to get across concepts, that is, say, values, beliefs, attitudes. It's mostly fiction stories or prototypical stories. Once there was a man who was a farmer, and okay, we all can picture a farmer. So it's a human being, it's a farmer. So it's a prototypical character position that we're creating. And what happens if it's a real person? Companies, they'll be doing stories for internal. They'll be going around trying to do change stories, and so they take, Bill Sykes was a manager at our Phoenix plant for 18 years, and all of a sudden, everyone in the audience is going, Bill Sykes, did you ever work at the Phoenix plant? Do you remember him? What shift was he? When was he there? Who else worked with him? Did he have a family? How many kids did he have? Where did they go to school? Do I remember any of them? Did they come to that annual party back in '94? They're lost to the story because they're trying to build up the rest of the character profile around a real character that relates to them. As soon as you get away from it's ultimately you got to have some of those stories. Mm-hmm. You got to back up the concepts with some real examples. But the role of those stories is more often than not best served as examples of a concept that is established by a story where you get to focus just on the story. Always, when I do workshops, the most effective stories are fiction ones.
Interesting.
Or ones that are personal anecdotes that are little quick anecdotal stories. They're not big stories. They didn't, something that happened when I went into a Burger King.
Yeah.
Those kind of little quickie stories that where it illustrates the concept. Well, you don't get that many of those, but you can take them from children's every nursery rhyme, every little children's story, the little simple, the bedtime story kind of nursery rhyme sorts of things. Every one of those exists to convey very specific concepts about how to be a human being, how to live in our society, and how to get by in the world, how the world works. And they do it very well. We use them generation after generation because they work. And they work much more efficiently than nonfiction stories.
Yeah.
And it's great it's not that you have to use those, but it's great to consider all possible sources of stories to make the point that you want to make at that moment to that audience.
Yeah.
And that's another.
Sorry, go ahead.
The companies limit themselves on is just by they sort of like put blinders on and consider very few of the potential sources they have for stories.
Yeah. Almost working to create that archive of stories is something maybe to constantly be thinking about. But that's
library story. Yes.
Yeah. You mentioned kind of in that point on going towards more fiction. I think you called it prototypical characters, or
Yep. Yep.
how helpful do you find some of that more kind of like Jungian thinking, the archetypal stuff? Is that in a same area, or what's your opinion on that stuff?
Um, sure, those can be useful. They also can be very limiting. But I look at it as there are a couple of key character positions that your brain is hardwired to think in, or say it a different way, your brain is hardwired to seek out characters from the information that's flowing into it to fill these specific character positions. Main character is one, antagonist is another. Viewpoint character is one. Who's telling me this story? How am I supposed to see it? One that usually gets left out is called the climax character. Hero often tries to get shoved in as being that character, and a hero is an example of a climax character. When you get to the climax of a story, and in most business stories, it's not that you don't have a long plot line. So there's usually business stories. Usually they're short, couple of minutes. There's an event. There's a happening. There's just one event in it, and then there's an outcome. Well, in that event, the question is, who has the power to really control how that event plays out? And let me give you it can be the main character, it can be the antagonist, it can be some other character. An example of an antagonist one. I went into a Burger King. This is one of these little kind of stories. Went into a Burger King. I was 55 at the time. And I went in there because it was early morning and I was in a little bitty town and I had checked out of my motel already. And I wanted to go get breakfast before I went to a high school. I was going to do workshops at high school all day. And then found that none of the restaurants, there were only 3 in town that would serve breakfast. None of them opened until 7. This was like 6:20 in the morning. There was a Burger King, the only fast food restaurant in the whole town. So went there, big long line of cars through the drive-in. So I went inside, walked up to the counter and said, I was going to get a coffee, read the paper until 7, go get breakfast, go to the school. I said, want a coffee. And this girl, if someone had told me she was 13, I would have believed it. She probably would have said she was 18 or 19, but big smile, pointed at the sign on the wall next to her and said, senior citizen discount. And it said for anyone over 62, senior citizen discount applied. 55 at the time. I said, really? How much is the senior citizen discount? She said, well, it's normally $1.05 for the coffee. It'll only be $35 with the discount. I said, wow, that's a great deal. Of course, I'm only 55. I don't qualify. And she looked at me with one of those great big smiles and said, oh, it's okay. You look plenty old enough to me. Okay. In that story, so I took the senior citizen discount. But as I walked away, I realized I was really angry. And I couldn't decide if I was angry at her for thinking I was 62 and 55. I was starting to brush against it and didn't want to look like it, or if I was mad at myself for not thinking of a good comeback.
Right.
She, I'm sure, walked away thinking that she had just done a great job of customer service, right? But so a couple of points come out of that. One, in that story, she's really that climax character. I'm the main character, but she's the one that has the power to make it come out the way it's supposed to, the way. And the fact that it didn't come out the way I wanted it to means usually if the story doesn't come out the way the main character wants it to, the way that you want, the audience, if you've identified with the main character, the way you want the story to come out, you get very upset and you want the story to come out differently, which, by the way, for business stories is the most powerful motivator for changing behavior. Negative stories motivate behavioral change more than positive ending stories or example stories, role model stories.
Yeah.
Role model stories do a wonderful job of setting up long-term attitudinal and belief shifts, but not so much short-term behavioral shifts. Those are far more powerfully and consistently and successfully driven by negative ending stories. But anyway, the other thing that comes out of that, if you had asked that little girl at the counter, her version of the story and mine would be radically different. And she would have thought that she did a great job of customer service and would be shocked to find out that I was angry at her and thought that I was gotten a lousy job of customer service, which means the story you tell that you think is so clear is not the story that they hear. The story they hear is that self-created version. That's the one you're trying to control. And that's why all those story elements are so important, is because you're trying to control not what you say, but what goes on inside their head.
Yeah.
And so that those story elements become then the tools that you have to control how they construct this story.
Wow. We'll be right back.
This podcast is produced by StoryFirst Media, a video content production company focused on storytelling. Cultivate your audience with story, then convert them to customers. Let us know about your upcoming video project at www.storyfirstmedia.com.
If you're consuming this content, you're either listening to it as a podcast or you're viewing it as a video, because it exists in both forms. If you'd rather watch my guests and I talk over Skype video, you can find this and all subsequent episodes by subscribing to my YouTube channel. Or if you'd rather listen to the conversation, it's available for download wherever you get your podcasts. I really think these conversations are valuable and will only get better as we go on. And having earned your attention means the world to me. These aren't short conversations. So if you have any comments, questions, suggestions for guests or topics, books I should read, etc., please email me at thenatureofstory@gmail.com or get me on Twitter or Facebook at Michael Neelsen. That's Neelsen. All right, back to the interview. I mean, when you think about it that way, you start thinking about this is all communication, and this is all trying to put any idea you want into another person's mind,
Right.
and
Yep.
you can run into a place then where the thought easily becomes, well, hell, everything should be a story. But what's your response to that?
Well, there, at one level, everything is interpreted internally in story terms. You can't get away from that. It happens subconsciously. It happens automatically. It happens in every person. The question is, what do you have? So your goal is to put certain imagery, certain thought, a vivid image, an idea, concept in someone's head anytime you want to communicate. So the question is, what do I have to do to get my thought into their conscious mind? Now, what we call story, telling a story, is one very powerful vehicle for doing that, for carrying those messages, because it automatically provides those bits of information that the neural story net, the neural circuitry in the audience's mind requires. Mm-hmm. But think of the sort of folk saying, a stitch in time saves nine. Well, that's not a story. But when you hear it, in order to make that make sense to you, sort of instantly you spin up a whole story.
Yeah.
That goes with it. So if I think your mind is going to spin up the right kind of a story, I don't need to provide the story to get it into your brain, to get it into your conscious mind at this point in time. It's all a question of then knowing your audience.
Yeah.
Who's your audience? What do they think? What do they believe? What do they think that's correct? What do they think that's dead wrong, but they still think it anyway? What do they know about the topic that I want to talk about? What do they think about me? If you're the one who's doing the talking, you're a character in your story, even if you're talking about someone else. So know, what are their issues? What do they care? What do they care about? What's relevant to them at this moment in time? Does my topic, what I want to talk about, relate to what's relevant to them? How do I make them connect to it? What are their drivers? What are their motives for right now, for running their lives, for what they do? And how do I then take what I want to talk about and by motive matching, make them see that what I want to talk about relates to what's important to them and get them to see it the right way. If you have to spell all that out, great. If you think you just need to say one word, one sentence, and it'll all pop up in their heads, also great. The only true measure of effective storytelling is what goes on inside the conscious mind and memory of your audience. We don't have direct access to it, so you're always playing with if you're looking for metrics, you're playing with surrogate metrics.
Yeah.
Unless you can take them into the lab and wire them up.
Right. I mean, in that regard, what in your mind, and maybe some of the stuff you're working on right now, what's some of the most interesting research on this at the moment? Are people asking any particularly interesting questions, breaking that down further as time goes on here?
Well, the work that I've done, there are two halves to the word storytelling. Story is a noun. Mm-hmm. It's a physical thing. It's an asset. Looking especially from a company's viewpoint, I mean, you can invest in stories, you can save them, you can share them, you can sell them, you can treat them like any other valuable asset. Okay? Telling is a verb. Mm-hmm. It's an interactive process. It's a personal skill, however it is that you're conveying the story, the medium that you're using, if you're doing it live, your mannerisms, the way that you project your voice and facial expressions, gestures, all those things. That's not something that can be banked, that can be shared. I can't say, well, here's my telling the story, I'll give it to you. No, you have to use the way you tell the story. So those two are actually very separate. We keep thinking of them being together, storytelling, because they come together at the final delivery, but the development of the two are really, and the concerns, the tools, the issues of those two parts are really very separate. Most of the research that I've done has been on the story part, and we've really unraveled that part to an amazing level of detail. And the research now is okay, and the focus is now, how do you take that and give it to people who are trying to apply stories in a form and in a way that makes sense to them, that arms them to be able to do the telling part more effectively. There's so many limits on the telling part. If you're a business person and you're going to go out and do a talk, you can't change your voice. You're not going to drop out for 6 months and take acting classes. You're not going to stand in front of a mirror and practice gestures. No, you got to let that stuff go. You're not going to go get a vocal coach and take vocal lessons. So you have to let that go. So the question is, how do you then take the tools of story to build up the material so that it is as good as it can get, and then mold it into the medium you're going to use, the audience you're telling to, your natural telling abilities. And that's where so it's, for a long time, people kept looking at storytelling and would go in circles and ask the same questions year after year after year. And now that we broke apart the story part and have really analyzed story and story structure and what happens inside the brain and how the brain relates to story structure, the focus now is on how can we get that information to people so that they do the telling part in their own lives and in their own environments and in their own situations more effectively.
And like, do you have any immediate thoughts on that? Like, what are the first steps people are trying in terms of solving that riddle of communicating that more? I know you work a lot in education.
I work, well, actually more in the last few years, it's been in government agencies and corporations.
Okay.
So working with companies more than in education. And it's process. I find the thing that helps the most is this. The tendency of most people is to say, I'm going to tell a story, and they want to dive into the story.
Right.
I've got a cute little story. I'm going to use it. Don't do it. the longer you can delay thinking about story, the more effective the story will be. Start with, who's my audience? Who am I going to talk to? What are their issues? What are their concerns? What's relevant for them? What's on their mind? What are their beliefs, attitudes, values, that stuff. Second, what do I want to say to them? What do I want them to remember? If I only get one sentence takeaway message, when they walk away and they look back here, I want them to think about, have one sentence just pop up in their heads over and over and over again. What is it? I want one picture to pop up in their heads, and those two need to relate. And I want to know, how do I want them to feel when that picture pops up into their head and they remember that sentence? And then say, all right, now a story would be an appropriate way, a vehicle to communicate that sentence and that image, that one picture in time, and the emotion that goes with it. Because stories do that real well. And then think, all right, now we know that there are certain those character positions that they're going to try to fill. Main character, antagonist, climax character. Do I want this to be a positive ending story or a negative ending story? Do I want it to be a cautionary tale, negative ending stories, or a role model story? Do I want it to be a real life story? Do I have a real life story? Is it a work story, or is it a personal story that demonstrates the concept? Is it an example of the concept at play? Do I want to just use a fiction story? And then, after you've really not just mulled over, but actually articulated to the point where you've written down all that stuff, then you can start to say, all right, now let's look at the story. And then as you're developing the story, you always have metrics to go back to look at. Well, this story, as I'm now playing with it, this story that happened to me at the office 5 years ago, or how we justified working up the network, the budget for the network that we've created. But whatever is the story, will it deliver that picture and that takeaway sentence and that emotion to my audience, and will they relate to the characters that I put in the story because of knowing where my audience is? If you define all those things first, then the stories start to flow. But if you jump to the story, which is what everyone wants to do, then the story winds up, it can be cute, but it never really has purpose. It never really resonates with a real purpose. And so I find that part of it is then the process, not worrying about the story as soon, worrying about what it is you want the story to do.
Yeah.
And then the story.
That reminds me a lot, given that my background's in filmmaking, and Robert McKee talks all the time about the idea of for screenwriters, delay the actual writing of the script for as long as you can.
As long as you can.
Just do research. Just get.
It's absolutely true, and it applies, I think, probably to all creative communication.
Yeah.
Because once you get started on the thing itself, you're into the formatting and the dialogue and the moments and the flow of them, and you get lost in them, which is a good thing. But before you get lost in them, you want to have some bounds so you always know where you are when you step back out of it for a moment.
Yeah. So I guess as one of the final thoughts here, we're talking about this power of storytelling. You're talking about the idea that it, as you said, it doesn't. Everything becomes a story in the interpretation. You can't avoid this. Given that you can't avoid it, and given that this is the world that we're in, this is a weird question, I suppose, to ask a scientist, but what responsibility do you feel storytellers maybe have in wielding such power?
Actually, I think that's a very relevant question. That's probably one of the most relevant questions. I was last fall, I was at University of Missouri at a medical ethics conference. I was keynoting it. And that was the question, was what is the responsibility of a medical professional when you're dealing with patients, and the ones what they were worried about were, one family member has had a stroke, and so what do you tell to that patient? What do you tell to the family? And so my job, really, what I decided my job was to say that no, you can't just say, I'm a doctor, here are the facts. Here's the medical here's a printout of the charts. Here's the data.
Yeah.
And say, I gave you the data. You know everything there is to know, because that audience doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that the communicator is responsible. The communicator should accept responsibility, not for what comes out of their mouth or what they write on their pen, but for what gets into the conscious mind and memory of their audience.
Yeah.
And as soon as you accept that responsibility, you look at your material completely differently. Yeah. You say, yes, I do. I can't just say what I want to say, knowing what I know, because, and I'll use the medical example again. Those bits of data, those hard numbers, I don't know, blood chemistry, for example, in some abnormalities in blood chemistry. When a doctor looks at those, in their mind, because they have all of this background of context information, it creates a perfectly rational, relevant story. To someone without any of that background information, without any of that topical information, the story that it creates is likely to be radically different. And to me, then the doctor is responsible for the story that gets to their conscious mind, so has to then interpret the numbers for them in a way that puts an accurate picture into the conscious mind and memory of the audience. But I think that's true for every person who tries to communicate. It's a question of accepting responsibility as we start to develop the tools around story structure and how stories work. You can begin to accept responsibility for that, and ultimately, of course, what it does is improve the effectiveness of communication. That's what it's all about.
Yeah. What is on the point of kind of the being on the forefront of studying the storytelling part now? What is some of the stuff people should be watching in terms of how this is developing? When you say developing these tools and things of this nature, obviously there's your work that you're working on. Are there other people should be watching or other researchers, things that are happening right now that are of interest to you?
Good question. There are people doing some really interesting work. Paul Zak at Claremont University. Have you talked to him?
I have not.
But he's doing some really interesting stuff. I'm also looking at the Pentagon.
Oh, interesting.
Every time in the last 15 years, the military, more than any other group, has started to realize that story is an incredibly powerful tool in accomplishing their missions. Because ultimately their mission isn't about killing people. It's not about firing weapons. It's about changing behavior. And that's why they now look at it. And that story, or narrative in their term, is as powerful a tool to do that as any other tool in their arsenal. And so I think over the next 5-6 years, there will be a broadening of the emphasis on story within the Department of Defense, and that'll spread to the Department of State, so that the federal government is suddenly going to become the driver of research and advancement here, as they have been in other fields at other points in time.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like you can almost detect some fragments of that in the public already when you hear members of the DoD already publicly saying, we have the better narrative. We're putting a narrative out there. We're doing.
Right. Even the fact that they're worried about that
Yeah.
they're trying to use those terms, and of course at the same time they're trying to struggle to say what is it, narrative, why does it work, why were the Taliban so much more successful at telling their stories than we were in
Right.
Afghanistan? Why is ISIS so successful on social media?
Yeah.
Why can't we easily counter them on social media? What is that? That's all story. That's all story work, and it's starting to fall on Department of Defense to take some responsibility for that work, which has always been a real sidelight for them.
Yeah. Well,
and they always have the budget to
right.
be able to throw money to throw some serious research at a topic.
Yeah. I mean, that's fascinating. Obviously, I think we're up on our time here with you, but I thank you so much for spending the time with me. This has been fascinating stuff. And I'll direct everybody to the book, and I'll read the Story Smart book coming up as soon as well.
Story Smart is really what happened when we went into the lab and started to do the in lab testing, mostly EEG, a little fMRI lab, and see can we go into the lab and validate all of the information that I gathered up from all of those other fields of research.
Yeah.
Do we see it happen when we go into the lab?
I guess that actually leads me to one final question, if you don't mind. When I think about from a science standpoint, the idea of an emergent truth, the idea that this is like something that's been verified and replicated and all these things, how much do you bang that drum? How much do you assert, this is like what we're finding with the structure of story, at least if we separate those ideas, the structure of story and how the story net is there, and how it's not what reaches the people is not what reaches our senses, is how we interpret it. How much of an emergent truth can we say that really is?
There is still lots of room, as science likes to do, to replicate the studies. Mm-hmm. The studies that we've been able to do, both with government funding and some that I've done with private funding, combined with what other people are finding doing their work. Paul Zak is another one who's done some related work for totally different purposes, but I've been able to grab what he's done and use it to verify, are incredibly consistent and incredibly compelling.
Yeah.
It's there is no ambiguity in what we are finding. What it needs to do is be replicated enough so that we can remove questions about sample size.
Oh, sure.
And does we think that it's global, these things we're finding. But the research that says it's global has been, once we've done research within the U.S. with U.S. populations, to then go to the folk literature, mostly is what I've done. It's gone to folk literature from every culture, every population whose folk literature has ever been recorded in any way, and say, are there the folk stories that last, the folk stories that have real resonance within that community, do they have the same structure? Mm. And if they have the same structure, then we can say it's very likely that what we're finding here in terms of neural structure also applies there, even though we haven't had anyone from that particular population in the EEG lab to test them. And so there's room for that kind of replication on the studies, but it's just amazing how definitive and how easily verifiable they are. I mean, things like, as I mentioned, going into a lab and saying, well, looking at a new test audience that comes in, when you test them before you wire them up, you say, all right, if we use version 4 of this story, which changes one line on the motive, here's what we'll get in their response, and here's what we'll be able to measure, and here's how and find out that we're exactly right. On being able to measure their emotional resonance at the end of the story, and their attitudes toward the various characters and their interpretation of the story, and then be able to say how powerful it is or isn't with that group as we measure it when we bring them back in, say, 3 months later.
Yeah.
Wind back up and then have them recount the story and say, after that length of time, do they still remember the story accurately? And when they recall the story, do they still exhibit the same emotional charge with it that they had when they heard it?
Yeah.
Or has that faded? If a story is really powerful, the emotional charge tends to hold, and the heart of the story tends to remain very accurately fixed in your mind. Some of the details can shift, and you'll invent some of your own details around the story. But so we can use those kind of time delay measures as a good metric for how strongly influential a story really is. Not just, did it move you today, but is that effect lasting?
Yeah.
All of those, those things, they just are so solid. When I go around, I can beat the drum and say, yeah, this is what we're finding, and this is the way it is.
Yeah. That's fascinating, and I would imagine, I would think very soon after some of these become more popularized and known about, in terms of the predictive power you're talking about there that's coming with understanding it, the entertainment industry, I'd have to imagine, will totally want to jump on that ability to do stuff.
That's really interesting, and I wonder about that. People who write novels,
Yeah.
people, and this is also true of storytellers. Most storytellers, stand up on stage, main stage storytellers, can't articulate why a story works.
Right.
They just say, because it does. And why they do something a certain way. They say, because that's the way you have to do it.
Yeah.
And so for a certain percentage of the population, this becomes very intuitive. And those are the people that tend to drift into or are drawn toward those fields. Yeah. Scripting, writing for movies, acting, stand-up storytelling, writing novels. And so as you get more articulate information out and around about exactly what's going on and why it's happening, it'll be interesting to see if it affects them very much or not. Or they'll say, well, duh, yeah, that's the way you do it. And why'd they bother to prove it? Because we've known that for 1,000 years.
Right.
I don't know. So I don't know if it will or not.
Yeah. That'll be fascinating to watch. Well, I've taken you a little bit past our hour. Thank you so much for your generosity of your time. And it's been great having you here, obviously.
It's been fun.
You've been listening to The Nature of Story. I'm Michael Neelsen. You can find Kendall's books on Amazon.com or KendallHaven.com. This podcast was produced by StoryFirst Media, a video content production company focused on storytelling. Our editor is Ryan Smith. Original music composed by Alexander Valdes. Until next time, I'm Michael Neelsen.